The alarms on the Vaith border station screamed for exactly 4 seconds before someone silenced them, because no one could believe what the sensors were showing. One ship, a single Terran warship, crossing the threshold line into the Vaith dominion with no escort, no fleet, no warning shot fired. In 10,000 years of coalition history, no vessel had ever entered enemy space uninvited and lived long enough to regret it. Fleet Admiral Sarath Cole stood at the observation deck of the neutral relay station HFY, watching the tactical display with 4 of her eyes narrowed and the 5th twitching, a nervous habit she had never managed to train out of herself. The dot on the screen was small, insignificant by any measure that mattered in a galaxy of dreadnoughts and starforts. "Confirm the reading," she said. Her aide, a younger officer named Doss, did not look up from his console. "Confirmed, Admiral. Terran hull signature. Designation, Kestrel's Vow. Crew complement estimated at 40, maybe fewer. No fleet support detected within 12 light years." "That's impossible." "It's happening anyway." Cole had fought 2 border skirmishes against the Vaith in her career and lost both. She had watched entire coalition battle groups turn back at the threshold line rather than risk what lay beyond it. The Vaith did not take prisoners. They did not negotiate. They erased. And now one human ship alone was sailing directly into their teeth. "Get me a channel to Earth Command," Cole said. "Already tried. They're not answering." "Try again." Doss tried again. Nothing but silence came back. The kind of silence that felt deliberate, like a door closed softly and locked from the inside. 300 light-years away, aboard the Kestrel's Vow, Captain Elena Voss stood on the bridge with her hands folded behind her back, watching the stars smear past the viewport as the ship pushed deeper into hostile territory. She was 41 years old, gray threading early through dark hair she kept cropped short, and her face had the stillness of someone who had already made peace with dying a long time ago. "Sensor ghosts at the edge of the array, Captain," said Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand from the tactical station. "Could be Vaith patrol drones. Could be nothing." "Assume it's something," Elena said. "Run silent. Cut anything that isn't life support or engines." The bridge crew moved without hesitation, and that was the thing that struck outside observers most when the recordings were finally released years later. 40 people, deep inside the most dangerous territory in known space, and not one of them asked why. Not one of them asked if this was a suicide mission. They simply worked, calm and precise, like a crew that had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times in their heads. Only one man on the bridge looked uneasy. Devrin Marsh, 26 years old, freshly transferred from a border cutter and still new enough to the Kestrel's Vow that he hadn't learned to stop asking questions. "Captain," he said quietly, stepping close to her chair. "Respectfully, we're one ship. If the Vaith catch us out here—" "They won't catch us," Elena said. "Not yet." "That's not really an answer." Elena turned her head and looked at him, and something in her eyes made him wish he hadn't spoken. Not anger. Something heavier. Grief, maybe, worn so long it had turned into armor. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She turned back to the viewport before he could press further, and the moment closed like a fist. In the lower decks, away from the bridge, a young engineer named Toby Reyes ran his hand over a sealed container bolted into the deck of the captain's private quarters, a container he had personally installed 6 months earlier, under orders that came directly from Fleet Command and no one else. He didn't know what was inside it. He only knew the captain checked it every single day, and that once, when he'd asked her about it in passing, she had gone pale and changed the subject so fast it left the air in the room feeling strange for an hour afterward. He didn't ask again. Back on the bridge, Priya's console chirped, low and urgent. "Captain, I'm reading a Vaith long-range array coming online. Deep space class. If it's active, they'll have a track on us within the hour." "Then we've got an hour," Elena said. "Helm, adjust course. Take us in deeper before they can lock a firing solution." "Deeper into their space?" Devrin said, disbelief cracking his voice. "Captain, that's not evasion, that's the mission," Elena said, and something in her tone ended the conversation completely. The Kestrel's Vow pushed forward, alone past listening posts and dead relay stations, past the bones of old battles the Coalition had lost decades before Elena was even born. The deeper they went, the quieter the bridge became, until the only sound was the low hum of the engines and the occasional soft chime of a sensor sweep coming back clean. Then, 4 hours into the silence, the comm officer's station lit up with an incoming transmission, not from the Vaith, not from Earth, but from somewhere in between. A signal bounced through 3 dead relays and badly degraded by the time it reached them. "Captain," the comm officer said, voice tight, "you need to hear this." Elena crossed the bridge in 3 strides. The message played, warped and broken, a woman's voice, not Elena's, not anyone aboard, speaking in old Terran standard, the kind used in official transmissions decades ago. "If you're hearing this, the mission is still active. They never stopped looking for us. Tell them we're still here. Tell them." The signal died in a burst of static. The bridge went utterly silent. Every eye turned toward Elena Voss, whose face had drained of all color, whose hand had risen without her seeming to notice it, and pressed flat against her chest, over her heart, like she was holding something in that threatened to break loose. "Captain?" Priya said carefully. "Do you know that voice?" Elena didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and it carried a weight that made even the most disciplined officers on the bridge feel the floor shift beneath them. "That's not possible," she said. "She's been dead for 30 years. Before anyone could ask what she meant, the ship lurched violently, alarms exploding across every console at once. Priya's hands flew across her station, and when she looked up, her face had gone rigid with fear. "Captain, we've got contacts, multiple contacts closing fast. It's not a patrol." She swallowed hard. "It's a fleet, and they knew exactly where to find us." On the main viewport, the stars ahead began to blot out one by one as Vaith warships dropped out of stealth formation in a wall stretching from horizon to horizon, weapons already charging, and Elena Voss stood at the center of her bridge, staring at the impossible voice still echoing in her mind, as the trap she had walked into for 30 years finally closed around her. 3 days after the Kestrel's vow vanished from every sensor in Coalition space, Ambassador Rylan Doe stood in a hallway on Earth that smelled faintly of rain and old stone, waiting for a meeting that human command kept delaying. He had expected panic. Grief, maybe, or at least the frantic scramble of a species watching one of its own ships fly into a slaughterhouse. Instead, he found calm. Quiet, deliberate calm, the kind that unsettled him more than screaming would have. "They're stalling," he said to his aide, a young Threll diplomat named Vessa who had accompanied him from the Coalition capital. "Or they already know something we don't." "Maybe both," Vessa said. The doors finally opened and General Marcus Hale walked in, tall, silver-haired, a man who had spent 40 years in Earth's military before most of the Coalition even believed humanity was worth watching closely. He didn't sit. He didn't offer refreshments. He simply looked at Rylan with the patient, unreadable expression of someone who had already decided how much he was willing to say. "Ambassador," Hale said, "you have questions." "One ship, General. One ship crossed into Vaith space with no fleet, no declared objective, no diplomatic notice to the Coalition. Do you understand what that looks like from where I stand? It looks like either recklessness or provocation, and either one could drag every species in the Coalition into a war none of us are prepared to fight." "It's neither," Hale said. "Then what is it?" Hale was quiet for a long moment. "It's a debt being paid." "That tells me nothing." "It's not meant to tell you anything, it's meant to buy time." Hale's jaw tightened just slightly, the only crack in his composure. "Captain Voss knows exactly what she's doing. She's been preparing for this longer than you've held your post, Ambassador. Longer than most of the officers on this base have been alive." Rylan studied him. "You keep saying her name like it means something." "It does. You just don't know it yet." Before Rylan could push further, Hale turned and walked out, leaving the ambassador standing in a room that suddenly felt colder than it had a moment before, far from Earth in the depths of a data archive few outside the highest levels of Coalition command even knew existed. Rylan later found what he was looking for, buried under decades of clearance restrictions, a file so old its formatting predated half the technology currently in use. A first contact incident, a human outpost called Meridian Station, established in the earliest days of humanity's expansion beyond its home system, decades before Earth formally joined the coalition. The file was heavily redacted, but the shape of the truth still showed through the black bars like a shadow under a door. Meridian Station had made contact with an unknown vessel. The exchange had begun peacefully, and then, without warning, without provocation that the surviving records could identify, the station had been destroyed. Only one survivor was listed: Elena Voss, age 11. Rylan sat back slowly, the weight of it settling into his chest. A child. She had been a child. He kept reading, and the next detail nearly stopped his heart. The vessel responsible for the massacre had been identified decades later, through recovered wreckage analysis. Vaith design, Vaith weapon signature. A ship under the command of an officer whose name appeared in later Vaith military records as Warlord Tessic Gran. The same Tessic Gran who, as far as coalition intelligence could determine, now commanded the single largest fleet in the Vaith Dominion. Rylan's hands were shaking slightly as he closed the file. This wasn't recklessness. This wasn't even revenge, not in the simple sense he'd first assumed. This was something that had been building for 30 years, quietly, patiently, while the rest of the galaxy assumed humanity was still finding its feet among older, more powerful species. He thought of General Hale's words, a debt being paid. He didn't yet understand what that meant, but he understood finally that he had badly underestimated what he was dealing with. Deep inside Vaith space, aboard a ship the Dominion's own scanners had marked as destroyed on outdated intelligence reports, the Kestrel's vow drifted in the shadow of a dead moon near one of the Vaith's most heavily defended shipyards, powered down to the barest minimum required to keep the crew breathing. It had taken everything Elena had, every trick, every scrap of old intelligence about Vaith sensor blind spots gathered over 3 decades of quiet obsession, to get them this deep without detection after narrowly slipping the pursuing fleet through a debris field 2 days earlier. The ship's hull bore the scars of that escape, scorched and dented, but it had held. On the bridge, the crew worked in hushed tones, aware that even a raised voice might be the difference between survival and discovery. Life support at minimum, Toby Reyes reported from engineering, his voice barely above a whisper over the comm. We can hold like this for maybe 6 more hours before we need to risk power again. 6 hours is enough, Elena said. Devon Marsh sat at the auxiliary station watching her carefully. In the 2 days since the transmission, since that impossible voice that Elena still hadn't explained, she had barely slept. He'd seen her standing alone in the observation bay twice now, staring out at nothing, her hand pressed against that same spot over her heart. Captain, he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. That message, the voice, you said it wasn't possible. You said she was dead. Elena didn't look away from the viewport. Her name was Dr. Anya Reyes. She was Meridian Station's chief researcher. She died the same night I lost everyone else I loved. I watched it happen, Devon. I was 11 years old and I watched the station tear apart, and I have spent every year since then being told, by every report, every investigation, every closed file, that there were no survivors from her research team. None. So if that's true, then someone has been lying to me for 30 years, Elena said, and I intend to find out why. Before Devon could respond, the ship's proximity sensors flared to life, a soft chime that felt like a gunshot in the silence of the bridge. Priya's hands moved fast across her console, and her expression shifted from concern to alarm in the span of a breath. Captain, we've got movement. Vaith Interceptor Squadron, 6 ships launching from the shipyard. They're on a search pattern. Do they have us? Elena asked. Not yet, but that pattern's going to sweep right over our position in under 4 minutes. Elena's jaw set. 30 years of patience, of preparation, of waiting for exactly this moment had led her here, to a dead moon in the heart of enemy territory, with a crippled ship, and an impossible voice from her past still ringing in her ears. "Power up the engines," she said. "Weapons hot. If they find us, we're not running." Toby's voice crackled back, tense. "Captain, at minimum power we can maybe manage a 50% output on weapons. Against 6 interceptors, that's—" "I know what it is," Elena said. On the viewport, the 6 Vaith interceptors banked in formation and began their sweep directly toward the dead moon, their scanners sweeping in slow, deliberate arcs that would reach the Kestrel's Vow's position in under 2 minutes. Elena rose from her chair, calm settling over her like a second skin, the same calm the entire coalition had mistaken for recklessness. "Let them come," she said. "It's time they learned what a Terran warship actually is." The lead interceptor's targeting array locked, painting the Kestrel's Vow's hull in a wash of red light across every screen on the bridge, and the countdown to first contact began. The first shot came from the lead interceptor, a lance of blue plasma that should have vaporized the Kestrel's Vow's forward hull in a single strike. It didn't. "Shields holding," Priya called out, disbelief cutting through her own voice. "Captain, that was a direct hit and we're still—" "Return fire," Elena said, already moving toward the tactical display. "Target their engines first. We're not here to kill them if we don't have to." The order landed strangely on the bridge. Devrin Marsh, strapped into the auxiliary station and bracing for the ship to tear apart around him, looked up sharply. "Captain, they're trying to kill us. Why does it matter if—" "Because it matters," Elena said, and there was no room in her voice for argument. The Kestrel's Vow answered with a spread of precision fire that tore through the lead interceptor's engine housing, without touching its crew compartment. The ship spun off, disabled but intact, tumbling away into the dark. 2 more followed within seconds, crippled with the same surgical accuracy. Weapon systems and propulsion stripped away while life support and crew decks remained untouched. On the remaining 3 interceptors, Vaith pilots who had been trained their entire lives to expect brutal, indiscriminate slaughter from any enemy found themselves facing something they had no framework for. An enemy that could have killed them and chose not to. It rattled them more than the weapons fire had. Aboard his flagship 2 systems away, Warlord Tessic Gran watched the engagement data stream in with a growing, cold unease he did not allow to show on his face in front of his officers. He was old, by Vaith standards, his scarred hide marked with the ritual patterns of 40 years of command, and he had fought humans exactly once before, 30 years ago, in an engagement he had ended with total, efficient destruction. He remembered the outpost. He remembered giving the order. He had told himself for 30 years that it was necessary, a defensive strike against an unknown threat before it could become something worse. He had believed it mostly, the way soldiers learn to believe the things that let them keep functioning. "Warlord," his second-in-command said carefully, "the interceptor squadron has failed to destroy the target. Should we commit a larger force?" Gran stared at the tactical display, at the small human ship still holding position near the dead moon, fighting with a precision that felt less like desperation and more like a message. "Pull them back," he said. "Warlord?" "I said pull them back." His voice was low, controlled, but something in it made his officers exchange uneasy glances. "I want a full sensor sweep of that vessel's registry markings. Now." It took 11 minutes. When the data came back, Gran read it twice before he allowed himself to believe it. Kestrel's Vow. Registered under Earth Fleet Command, commissioned under the personal authorization of a name he recognized, a name he had buried in his memory for 30 years alongside everything else about that night. Captain Elena Voss, the girl, the one survivor. Gran set the display down slowly, and for the first time in decades the old warlord felt something close to fear. Back aboard the Kestrel's Vow, the 3 remaining interceptors broke off and retreated, exactly as Gran had ordered, leaving the crippled ships drifting behind them. Elena watched them go without relief, her expression tight and distant. "They're pulling back," Priya said. That's not normal Vaith doctrine. They don't retreat from a wounded target, they finish it." "They recognize the ship," Elena said quietly, "or the name on it." Devrin unstrapped himself and crossed the bridge toward her, his earlier fear giving way to something more focused now, more determined. Captain, I think it's time you told the crew what's actually happening here. All of it. We just fought and won a battle we shouldn't have survived, on a mission none of us fully understand. Chasing a ghost from 30 years ago. People deserve to know why. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and something in her seemed to finally give way. Some barrier she'd held in place through years of silence. Follow me, she said. She led him, along with Priya and Toby, down to her private quarters, to the sealed container bolted into the deck that Toby himself had installed 6 months earlier, without ever knowing what it held. Elena knelt beside it, entered a long sequence of codes, and the container hissed open for the first time since the mission began. Inside was a single data core, old technology, decades out of date, the kind of hardware Earth hadn't manufactured in 20 years. Elena lifted it out with hands that were not entirely steady. This belonged to Dr. Anya Reyes, she said, chief researcher at Meridian Station, the woman whose voice we heard in that transmission 2 days ago. She gave it to me the night the station was destroyed, before she put me in an escape pod and sent me away. I was 11 years old. I didn't understand what it was. I barely understood what was happening. I've spent 30 years trying to get someone, anyone in Earth Command, to tell me what's on it. And they wouldn't? Priya asked. They couldn't, or they wouldn't say why. Elena's jaw tightened. 6 months ago, that changed. Someone finally authorized me to open it, on one condition, that I bring it here, into Vaith space personally and use whatever's on it exactly as instructed. No fleet, no support, just this ship, and this crew. Why? Devrin asked. Why would Command send you alone into the most dangerous territory in the galaxy over a 30-year-old data core? Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she activated the core, and a holographic display flickered to life above it, grainy and old, showing a star map overlaid with coordinates deep inside Vaith territory. Coordinates for a facility that, according to every official coalition record, did not exist. Beneath the star map, a short line of text scrolled across the display, recorded in Dr. Reyes's own handwriting, digitized decades ago and preserved untouched until this exact moment. They are not dead. They never stopped experimenting. Find them before it's too late. The bridge fell utterly silent. Even Toby, who rarely had anything to say in front of the captain, stared at the display with his mouth slightly open. Captain, Priya said slowly, who is they? Who never stopped experimenting? Elena's eyes were fixed on the coordinates, her expression a mixture of grief and something harder, something that had been building for 30 years and had finally found a direction to point itself. I don't know all of it yet, she said, but I know the facility those coordinates point to is real, and I know it's less than 2 days from our current position. She looked up at her crew, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than it had any right to be. And I know we're not leaving Vaith space until we find out exactly what's inside it. Before anyone could respond, the ship's comm system crackled to life with an urgent alert from the bridge above. Vaith long-range communications had just intercepted and decoded, a fleet-wide order broadcast across the entire Dominion in Warlord Gron's own voice, and the translation scrolled across every screen on the ship a heartbeat later. All forces converge on Sector 9. The girl from Meridian is alive. Bring her to me, and bring the facility's records with her, whatever it costs. Elena stared at the words, and for the first time since the mission began, real uncertainty flickered across her face. He knows my name, she whispered. He's known this whole time. The ship lurched suddenly as new contacts flooded the sensor array. Not 6 interceptors this time, but dozens converging from every direction at once, and Elena Voss realized, with a cold certainty settling into her chest, that she had never been hunting Tessic Gron at all. He had been waiting for her. 47 Vaith warships dropped out of stealth formation around the Kestrel's bow, and for the first time since the mission began, Elena Voss felt something close to real fear settle into her chest. Options, she said, her voice tight but level. Now. There are none, Priya said, scanning the tactical display with growing horror. Captain, we are surrounded. Completely. There's no gap in that formation, no blind spot, nothing to run through. Then we don't run. Elena's eyes moved across the display, searching, calculating. Toby, what's our power reserve? Enough for one hard burn, maybe two. Toby's voice crackled back from engineering. After that, we're dead in the water regardless of what happens. Devrin gripped the edge of his console, watching the wall of energy. The ships on either side began closing it. Plasma fire lit up the void around them, close enough that the Kestrel's vow shuddered under near misses, alarms shrieking across every station. They made it through. Barely. But the price came due almost immediately. A stray shot clipped the ship's rear section as they broke free, and Toby's voice came back over the comm, shouting now instead of speaking. Hull breach, deck 4. We've got fire in the auxiliary corridor. Devrin was moving before Elena gave the order, sprinting from the bridge toward the lower decks with 2 damage control officers close behind him. What he found when he reached deck 4 was chaos, twisted metal, screaming alarms, and in the middle of it, a young crewman pinned beneath a collapsed support strut, flames spreading toward a ruptured coolant line. Devrin didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the wreckage, hauling at the strut with everything he had while the damage control officers fought the fire behind him. The strut gave way just enough. He pulled the crewman free a half-second before the coolant line ruptured fully, sending a wave of superheated vapor through the space they had just vacated. He made it clear. Mostly. The blast caught his left side as he dove for the bulkhead door, searing pain tearing through his shoulder and down his arm. He didn't remember much after that. Just Priya's voice on the comm, sharp with fear, calling for a medical team, and the strange, distant realization that he was more afraid of failing Elena than he was of the pain. By the time he was carried to the medical bay, unconscious and bleeding, the Kestrel's vow had broken free of the immediate pursuit, buying itself a narrow, temporary window of open space. Elena stood over him in the medical bay 20 minutes later, her hands clenched at her sides, watching the ship's overworked medical officer work to stabilize him. Guilt sat heavy behind her eyes, the particular guilt of a commander who had asked everything of her crew, and was only now beginning to understand the true cost of it. He'll live, the medical officer said quietly. But he needs real treatment, Captain. Not what I can give him out here. Elena said nothing for a long moment, then quietly, almost to herself, I'm sorry, Devrin. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain but focused. Don't, he managed. Don't you dare apologize, not for this. You almost died. So did that kid I pulled out. A faint, exhausted smile crossed his face. Worth it. Elena's composure cracked just slightly, just for a moment, before she forced it back into place. She turned to leave, needing distance, needing air, and Devrin's voice stopped her at the door. Captain, tell us the rest. All of it. We've earned that much. She stood there for a long moment, her back to him, before she finally turned around. Gather the senior crew on the bridge, she said. It's time. 20 minutes later, with the ship running silent again in the relative safety of a debris field, Elena stood before her assembled senior officers and told them everything she had spent 30 years piecing together on her own. Meridian Station had not been a simple colony outpost. It had been a deep space research facility, quietly funded, studying human adaptability in extreme environments, resilience, healing, endurance beyond normal biological limits. The Vaith had found it decades before Earth officially joined Coalition space, back when humanity was still considered a minor, unremarkable species barely worth cataloging. The Vaith hadn't attacked out of fear or provocation, as Earth had always publicly claimed. They had attacked to capture, to take the research and the researchers and anyone useful enough to keep alive. They didn't destroy the station to kill everyone, Elena said, her voice flat and controlled in the way of someone reciting something too painful to feel fully while saying it out loud. They destroyed it to cover their tracks, to make it look like a massacre with no survivors, so no one would come looking for what they took. But you survived, Priya said quietly. How? Dr. Reyes got me onto an escape pod before the attack finished. She didn't come with me. Elena's jaw tightened. I always assumed that meant she died. The transmission we intercepted 2 days ago proves that's not what happened. She survived. She's been alive this whole time, somewhere in Vaith space, and she just sent a message that says the experiments never stopped. The bridge was silent except for the low hum of the ship's systems. Command has known for years, Elena continued. Not the full picture, not until recently, but enough to understand there was an ongoing program running somewhere in Vaith territory, built on stolen human research and stolen human lives. They couldn't send a fleet without triggering a war that would get every captive there killed the moment shots were fired. So they waited. They built a plan around the one asset that could get in and out without announcing itself as an invasion. A single ship, a crew small enough to move without drawing the full weight of the Vaith military. They built the plan around you, Devrin said, still lying in the medical bay but listening over the open comm channel. This was never just a rescue mission. It's your family they've been holding. Elena's eyes were wet, though her voice never wavered. Dr. Reyes wasn't just my mother's colleague. She was my mother's closest friend, and after the attack, she was the only reason I survived. If she's alive, and if the facility those coordinates point to is real, there could be dozens of others still there, people who were supposed to be dead for 30 years. Priya looked at the tactical display, at the coordinates still glowing softly at its center, and then back at her captain. Then we go get them. We go get them, Elena agreed. But we need to move now, before Gran's fleet regroups and closes off every route to that facility, and we do it knowing that if this goes wrong there's no rescue coming, no backup. No fleet dared follow us here, and none will follow us to what's next. The ship's long-range sensors chimed softly, and Toby's voice crackled over the comm from engineering, tight with urgency. Captain, I'm reading Warlord Gran's flagship moving to intercept our projected course. He's not chasing us anymore. He's cutting us off, positioning his entire fleet directly between us and those coordinates. Elena stared at the display, at the overwhelming wall of Vaith firepower now standing squarely between the Kestrel's vow and the answers she had spent 30 years searching for, and felt the full weight of what came next settle over her like a shroud. Then we go through him, she said quietly, because there is no other way left. The bridge crew exchanged glances, the reality of the words sinking in, and on the tactical display, Warlord Gran's flagship began to move, not alone, but at the head of the largest concentration of Vaith firepower any human had ever seen assembled in one place, closing the last open path between the Kestrel's vow and the truth. Fleet Admiral Sarath Cole had broken exactly one protocol in her 30-year career, and she was about to break it again. Order the relief fleet to the threshold line, she said. Full readiness. I want them able to cross the moment I give the word. Doss stared at her. Admiral, Earth's standing directive is explicit. No coalition vessel is to cross the threshold line in support of the Kestrel's vow under any circumstance. It's not a request. It's a formal condition of the mission. I'm aware of what it says. Then why? Because I don't intend to cross it, Cole said. I intend to be ready if the order changes. She turned back to the display, watching the last known position of the Kestrel's vow flicker at the edge of their sensor range, before vanishing again into the dark heart of Vaith space. Whatever Earth is protecting by keeping us out, I want to be close enough to act the instant that protection stops mattering. Across the station, Ambassador Ryland Doe arrived at the same conclusion from an entirely different direction. Sitting hunched over a terminal with 3 days of stolen sleep behind him and a growing pile of decrypted fragments in front of him. It's not a rescue mission in the way we assumed, he said to Vesa, rubbing his eyes. Or it is, but it's more precise than that. It's surgical. One ship, minimal footprint, because if a coalition fleet crossed that line, the Vaith wouldn't just fight back. They'd have every reason to destroy whatever or whoever they're holding at that facility before it could be found. Evidence destruction. Standard doctrine for a species that erases its mistakes. So Earth's silence isn't arrogance, Vesa said slowly. It's the opposite. It's the only thing keeping the people at that facility alive. Ryland sat back, exhausted, which means every hour that Fleet sits on the threshold line waiting to help is an hour that could get someone killed the moment it moves. Cole, listening in from across the room where she had joined the briefing uninvited, felt something in her chest tighten at the thought. She had spent her whole career believing restraint was weakness, that the Coalition's caution against the Vaith was a shameful holdover from centuries of losses. Watching Earth choose that same restraint deliberately, at enormous personal cost, forced her to reconsider everything she thought she understood about strength. Then we wait, she said quietly, and we pray that one ship is enough. Deep inside Vaith space, the Kestrel's vow was running out of ship. Warlord Gron's flagship led a formation so large it blotted out the stars ahead of them, 47 vessels tightening into an unbroken wall between the Kestrel's vow and the facility coordinates burning steady on the navigation display. There was no path around them, no gap to thread, no maneuver clever enough to slip past 100-to-1 advantage in open space. "Captain," Priya said, her voice carefully controlled despite the numbers scrolling across her tactical display. "If we engage that formation directly, we don't survive contact." "I know," Elena said. "Then what's the plan?" Elena studied the display for a long moment, and then her eyes moved to something else entirely. A jagged debris field trailing off the flagship's port side, the wreckage of some ancient battle the Vaith had never bothered to clear. Old hulks, twisted metal, a graveyard of ships too dangerous and too dense for a formation that size to navigate cleanly. "They can't follow us through that," she said. "Not without breaking formation. Helm, take us straight into the debris field, best speed. We use the wreckage as cover and cut across their flank while they're forced to slow down and pick a path around it." "Captain, that's a field of dead ships," the helm officer said. "One wrong move and we're wreckage too." "Then don't make a wrong move." The Kestrel's vow dove into the debris field at a speed that made every structural alarm on the ship scream in protest, weaving between skeletal remains of long-dead warships with a precision that came from 30 years of a captain who had studied every scrap of Vaith tactical doctrine she could find, including exactly how their formations handled terrain like this. Behind them, Gron's fleet slowed, forced to break its perfect wall formation to navigate the wreckage, exactly as Elena had gambled they would. It bought seconds, not minutes, seconds, but it was enough for the Kestrel's vow to slip through a gap on the formation's flank and burst free on the far side, racing hard toward the facility coordinates, while the Vaith fleet scrambled to reform behind them. "We're through," Priya said, disbelief in her voice. "Captain, we're actually through." "Don't celebrate yet," Elena said, eyes fixed on the display. "He'll be right behind us." She was right. Gron's flagship broke from the reforming fleet and gave chase alone, faster and better armed than anything else in the formation, closing the distance with terrifying speed as the facility's outline finally became visible on long-range sensors. A sprawling installation built into the side of a dead moon, heavily shielded, heavily defended, and utterly silent. "Captain, that facility has point defense grids we can't punch through with the ship," Toby warned from engineering. "If we try a direct approach, we're finished before we're in transporter range." Elena's jaw tightened. "Then we don't take the ship in. Priya, Toby, you're with me. We take a shuttle through the defense grid's blind spot on the northern ridge, get inside on foot, and find whoever's still alive down there. Helm, you hold position here and keep that flagship busy as long as you can." "Captain, that's a suicide run," Priya said. "It's the only run we've got left." They launched the shuttle 12 minutes later, threading through a gap in the facility's defenses that existed only because of decades-old intelligence Elena had memorized from the very research Dr. Reyes had once been part of. The shuttle scraped through, alarms blaring, and touched down hard on a service platform near the facility's lower access point. Inside, the corridors were cold, dimly lit, and utterly silent in a way that felt wrong, like a held breath. Elena moved through them with her weapon raised, Priya and Toby close behind, following the pull of instinct and 30 years of grief toward the heart of the installation. What they found stopped her cold. Behind reinforced containment glass, Rows of stasis chambers stretched deeper into the facility than the eye could follow, each one holding a human form suspended in pale blue light. Dozens of them. Some old, some impossibly young, their features altered in subtle, disturbing ways that spoke of decades of quiet experimentation. And in the chamber closest to the entrance, alive, awake, staring back at her through the glass with eyes that hadn't aged the way they should have in 30 years, stood a woman Elena had spent half her life believing was dead. "Elena," Dr. Anya Reyes whispered, her voice cracking through a speaker grill beside the chamber. "You came." Before Elena could answer, before she could even process the impossible sight in front of her, a familiar, heavy voice echoed from the corridor behind them, calm and controlled in a way that made her blood run cold. "I always knew you would." Elena turned slowly to find Warlord Tessic Gran standing in the entrance to the chamber, unarmed, flanked by no guards, his scarred face unreadable in the pale blue light. "You've spent 30 years hunting the wrong villain, Captain Voss," he said quietly. "I destroyed your outpost, yes, that sin is mine, and I have carried it every day since. But the program you're looking at now, the one still running in this facility, I did not build it." His eyes moved past her, to the rows of stasis chambers stretching into the dark. "It was built from something your own people gave us. A design, a pattern, something human, encoded so deep in its architecture that my scientists have never fully understood it." Elena's grip tightened on her weapon. "You're lying. I wish I were." Gran took a slow step forward, and for the first time, something like genuine regret crossed his weathered face. "Ask her yourself, Captain. Ask the woman standing behind that glass what your father truly gave us the night before this all began." Elena's blood went cold. She turned to the stasis chamber, to Dr. Reyes's pale, grief-stricken face, staring back at her through 30 years of captivity, and watched the older woman's expression crumble into something that looked exactly like guilt. "Elena," Dr. Reyes said softly, her voice breaking. "There's something about your family you were never supposed to find out this way." Behind them, alarms began shrieking through the facility as the shuttle's proximity sensors detected Gran's flagship arriving in orbit above, weapons already charging, and the ground beneath the facility trembled with the first distant impact of covering fire meant to buy the Kestrel's vow only moments before everything Elena thought she knew collapsed around her entirely. The facility shook with the first impact of distant weapons fire, and Elena Voss stood frozen between a dying enemy's confession and a truth she had spent 30 years refusing to imagine. "Tell me," she said, her voice shaking despite everything she did to steady it. "Tell me what he means." Dr. Anya Reyes pressed a trembling hand against the inside of the containment glass, 30 years of grief and guilt finally breaking loose across her face. "Your father wasn't just a colonist, Elena. He was a scientist, working alongside me on Meridian Station, studying human resilience, adaptation, regeneration. Research meant to help people survive on worlds that should have killed them. Beautiful work. Important work." Her voice cracked. "The night the Vaith attacked, your father made a choice. He believed if he handed over a piece of it, an incomplete piece, deliberately flawed, he could buy enough time for the rest of us to escape. He didn't know they'd use even a flawed pattern as the foundation for something far worse. He didn't know they'd spend 30 years building on it." "He gave them the data," Elena whispered. "He's the reason this facility exists. He's the reason some of us survived that night," Dr. Reyes said gently. "Including you. He didn't betray humanity, Elena. He made an impossible choice to save the people he loved, and he paid for it with his life an hour later, right in front of me, refusing to give them anything more." Her eyes were wet. "He spent his last words asking me to protect you. That's the truth I've carried for 30 years. Not betrayal. Sacrifice." Gran, still standing quietly at the chamber entrance, lowered his head slightly. "The architect directive," he said. "That is what my scientists named the program built from what your father gave us. For 30 years I told myself it was a triumph. a weapon born from human ingenuity, perfected under Vaith discipline. His voice hardened with something that sounded almost like disgust at himself. It was never a weapon, Captain Voss. Look at the chambers around you, it was a cage. Decades spent trying to recreate something your species does naturally. Adaptation, resilience, the refusal to break, and decades of failing, because you cannot force what must be chosen. Another impact rocked the facility, closer this time, dust sifting down from the ceiling. "We don't have time for this," Priya said urgently, weapon raised toward Gron even as her eyes darted to the shaking walls. "Captain, that's your flagship's own fleet firing on this facility. If they're willing to bury it rather than let us take what's inside." "They are," Gron said grimly. "My officers received orders 30 minutes ago that superseded mine. If the architect directive cannot be recovered, it is to be destroyed completely along with everyone inside it. Myself included, apparently." He almost laughed, bitter and humorless. "It seems I am no longer as valuable as the secret I was protecting." Elena's mind raced. 30 years of grief and anger and confusion collapsing into something clearer, sharper, a decision forming with the same calm certainty that had carried her across the threshold line in the first place. "Then we get everyone out,"